So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara peoples as the traditional owners of and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, the beautiful Maiwar River in Meanjin. And on behalf of the AAP and UQ Philosophy, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their contribution to, their valuable contribution to Australian and global society. And we're lucky to be meeting here in a place, the place of the Blue Lotus, the place of the spear or spearhead, which would have been a traditional meeting place for local clans. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor Catherine Mills, who's one of Australia's most distinguished scholars in bioethics. Catherine is the Maureen Brunt Professorial Fellow in the Monash Bioethics Centre, where she also leads the Reproduction in Society Research Group. A Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities, she's made an internationally recognised contribution, many contributions, to our understanding of the ethical, social and regulatory challenges posed by innovation in reproductive biomedicine. Catherine's research sits at the intersection of ethics, gender and social justice, addressing the implications of technologies such as assisted reproductive technologies, prenatal genomics and epigenetics. Her team brings together empirical research with rigorous ethical and regulatory analysis, with a strong commitment to stakeholder and community engagement to ensure that reproductive innovation doesn't happen in isolation from those it affects most directly. Catherine is the author of three books, three important books: The Philosophy of Agamben, Futures of Reproduction, Bioethics and Biopolitics, and Biopolitics. She's also the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Feminist Bioethics. She's led multiple groundbreaking projects, including the first humanities project funded by the Medical Research Future Fund on topics ranging from mitochondrial disease prevention to the ethics of gene editing and prenatal testing. Her work is supported by major research councils and industry partners, reflecting both its academic excellence and real-world impact. And really, I can't think of anyone who would be better placed or is better placed than Catherine to talk about the question, the issue of philosophy in the time of impact. So thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Aurelia, for that introduction and bio. I'll have to borrow that from you if you don't mind. But first, I want to begin by thanking the organisers of the AAP for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure. And I have to say also a deep honour for me to be able to stand in front of a crowd of professional philosophers and give an address, because, you know, this was like a teenage dream for me, but I didn't imagine that this was actually something that people did today at that time. It was like, you know, my fantasy. So I am deeply honoured. I have to say, I'm also somewhat surprised, and I had to kind of think long and hard about why me, because I haven't actually worked in a philosophy department for about 15 years. So I don't I have a kind of vexed relationship to philosophy, if you like. It's not a straightforward relationship in any sense. Even as a PhD student, I did a PhD in philosophy, but that was on continental philosophy, which, you know, for some people is not real philosophy. But then feminist philosophy, also not real philosophy, and to top it off, bioethics. So I got the tripartite combination of not real philosophy. Um, so, so it's a bit of a surprise. But at the same time, I have, in the course of my career, had positions like director of a research centre, being head of school, in which there's a very impressive philosophy department. And as some of you know, I share my life with a philosopher. So I do have, I think, a kind of unique perspective on the way in which the discipline of philosophy has developed over the last 15 to 20 years in the course of my career. I should also say that I've been on the ARC College of Experts for the last 4 years. So that has given me, I think, a pretty, it's a unique privilege in a way to be in that position, because you actually see a lot of the kinds of research that people are doing in a way that you wouldn't necessarily see or have a holistic glimpse of without being in that position. So in the course of kind of having those roles and then being asked to do this address, I really kind of thought about what I would be talking about, and really started reflecting on my own work and career and what might be interesting about that for people who aren't directly in my area of research. And in the course of that, I decided that rather than talking specifically about the content of my research, I actually wanted to talk more about the practice of my research, and then think about that in a broader context about what it might mean for philosophy more generally in terms of the context that we all work in. So that's essentially what I'm going to be doing today, is thinking about this context that we are currently working in as academic philosophers. For the moment, I'm just going to claim myself as an academic philosopher, though, we can have a conversation about that. But it's just more straightforward for me to say we rather than you. So I wanted to kind of think about that question of what it is to be a philosopher today when we work in a very specific historical moment that's not always amenable to the kinds of work that philosophers do. So I wanted to think about that because I think it's a really crucial question for the survival of the discipline that we need to take on in a very serious way. So I know a lot of people have been thinking about this, so I'm not going to claim to be initiating a conversation, but I hope in some sense that I'm kind of coalescing a conversation through this moment. So just to give you a bit of background then for this paper, should click on, yeah? Nope, that doesn't work either. Not having any impact. Maybe I'm pointing the wrong way, but no, that's okay. No, it's not doing anything. As part of that thanks, I should have also said, I also pay my respects to the traditional owners of this amazing country that we're standing on. But I also wanted to acknowledge that what's really kind of exciting and touching for me today is that not only do we have a bunch of academic philosophers in the room, but we also have what are potentially the next generation of philosophers who have yet to even kind of learn much about what philosophy is. So I'm really, really thrilled to see at least 3 people in the room who are not yet academic philosophers, but who might one day be. Okay, so background. Thank you. So we know by working in academia these days that there are a lot of different pressures on us in terms of the kinds of work we do and how we spend our time, I suppose. So, the kind of pressures that we might think about as shaping research in particular are things like research funding, or shaping universities, research funding regimes. Then there's the whole worry about international rankings. In the education space, I think AI is one of the kind of really big emerging challenges or present challenges for education and teaching philosophy. And university funding models are obviously really significant. I think, though, within the research space in particular, the most pressing structural influence for me at the moment is what we call the impact agenda, or what has been called the impact agenda. And I want to talk about that impact agenda and what it means for philosophy. But before I get on to that, I want to make a couple of really important caveats. So I want to be clear right from the start that I am completely agnostic about the value of different ways of doing philosophy or different subdisciplines of philosophy. I want to really state right from the start that this is not an argument for applied ethics. Okay, I'm not kind of privileging applied ethics over other areas of philosophy. I think it's really important to note that all areas of philosophy can have impact. We see that all the time, that philosophy across the board has impact. The difference is how we approach that question of impact, and that's the issue that I want to talk about. So often, impact in philosophy is serendipitous. We don't set out to do impact, but it kind of emerges that someone hears our paper and then they take it up in some other context that we never imagined to begin with. So that happens, and that can happen across the board. It can even be more systematic than that. So, you know, people working in quantum physics, for instance, can engage with physicists and actually have impact that way very intentionally. Again, it's not quite what I want to be arguing or talking about here, as you will see later on. So it's also important for me to say that I'm not going to be telling you how to do impact or engagement. That's, you know, not my job. That's a job for the research office at your university, and I do plenty of that in other circumstances. And it's just not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about something that I think is actually much more interesting and much more important for philosophers to think about, which is the impact of the impact agenda for philosophy itself. I should also say, as some of you know, I'm also doing some empirical research around this issue at the moment. I've done interviews with quite a few people in philosophy already and planning to do some more. I'm not actually going to be talking about the results of that today. That's still kind of ongoing, hasn't yet been analysed, so there's nothing I can usefully say about that, but I will actually be writing a paper drawing on that research in due course, and then we can have a conversation about that. So just to give you a sense of the structure of the paper, I'm first going to talk through what I mean by the impact agenda, just very quickly. Then I will talk briefly about the question of what is philosophy, because I think that is an interesting issue when we think about the context we're currently working in. Then I want to bring those two things together to think about the impact agenda and philosophy and the implications of that, and particularly pick out what I think is a new emerging trend, or present trend. I shouldn't say emerging because I think it's here. A present trend of people doing what I will call impact philosophy. And I'll try to sketch out a little bit about what I mean by the idea of impact philosophy, and then think about some issues for further consideration. So what is the impact agenda? Everyone, I presume, has heard this phrase at some point in their careers. But at least you've heard impact. Everybody knows that what we're supposed to be doing is impact. And impact is thought about differently in different contexts. So lots of times at universities, we talk about impact and we try to kind of have a nuanced, broadened conversation about impact, including impact within the discipline. Unfortunately, that is one way of thinking about impact that's not actually consistent with the impact agenda. The impact agenda is a policy framework that was established and operationalized based on the expectation that academic research should demonstrate measurable economic or cultural benefits beyond academia. So it was really externally facing impact that was interesting to the impact agenda. And measurable is really important, as we will come back to at various points. So this was a framework, a policy framework that was first developed in the UK really kind of starting in conversations from the 1990s onwards, though it wasn't till about 2014 that the UK had its first kind of formal research assessment exercise where they focused on and quantified impact, which was done through particular kind of impact case studies. But it had actually been part of conversations for a long time, and really based on this idea around what are the kind of social returns on investment that a society and a state might expect from university research when they were indeed publicly funded institutions for the most part. So building on from that UK experience, Australia has also kind of taken up the policy impact agenda in a very, very systematic way. So probably more systematic in some ways even than the UK. So the short-lived research excellence exercise of 2018 has sometimes been seen as an example of how research quantification should be done. That's not obviously how many academics in Australia think of it, but that's how some policy people think of it. Beyond Australia, well, actually, I should say, you might be thinking at this point, okay, so that research impact exercise happened in 2018, but then it was cancelled. So why do we still talk about impact? Well, if you're wondering about that and wondering whether impact is still a kind of super salient thing for Australian academics, I think you just need to read the discussion paper around the transformation of the national research funding framework to understand that impact is now fully embedded in research. So one of the things that discussion paper proposes is doing away with the distinction between linkage grants, which were seen as the impact-driven, social kind of socially engaged research, and the discovery grants, which were the blue sky theoretical research. Going forward, we won't have that distinction. That doesn't mean that impact is going away. It means that impact is built in across the board. Okay, so that is actually a really important thing for us to be thinking about as philosophers and the survival of philosophy as an academic discipline, because it has or could have significant implications for things like research funding. So that's Australia at the moment, but this idea of the impact agenda has also spread internationally through Canada, the USA, and various European countries. So we're not isolated in taking up this. This is a very significant worldwide trend that's not going anywhere soon. So that's basically what we're talking about with the impact agenda. So what's its historical context? Where did it come from? Well, interestingly, I think this is tied to a really significant changing social role for universities more generally. So I'm not going to go right back to the start of the university and talking about medieval universities and so on, but even just for the modern university, we can think about the 19th century conception of the university really saw universities as a space for individual human development. It was where you could become a better person through learning. There was a very strong emphasis on academic freedom and institutional autonomy. Universities were self-governing, and people in those universities should be able to research whatever was necessary for them to pursue. There was a strong unity of research and teaching, and there was a strong emphasis on social transformation through individual development. So the university was seen as having a social role, but it was still seen also as being autonomous and self-governing. And within that, interestingly enough, philosophy was seen as a kind of meta-discipline. It actually was seen as a unifying discipline that helped all of the sciences and all of the other disciplines speak to each other. So it had a very foundational role to the university. Where are we now? Well, we're now in this kind of 21st century post-neoliberal, if I can say that. I'm not quite sure that this moment is neoliberal anymore. Way of thinking about the university, which is significantly different. Some of those ideas still come through, obviously. We have not had a full transformation, but the university's role has changed significantly. So since then, we've had a kind of expanded role for training for the professions. So, obviously we know that faculties like medicine, law and arts predated the 19th century through medieval universities and so on. But things like the kind of vocational or professions like engineering, science and business all established schools in universities in the early part of the 19th century. And that, I think, signals an interesting shift. We also see today an increasing subservience of the university to the state through funding models. So we know that that's the case in Australia. We know that the dog that wags the tail of universities in Australia is state funding, okay? Whenever something happens in universities, you just look to see what the newest policy on funding of universities is. We also see that kind of subservience very clearly in what's happening in the USA today, where Trump is kind of bullying universities into getting rid of diversity and equity, for instance, through funding, even universities that aren't actually majorly publicly funded. We also see an increasing integration with industry that is not going away, okay? Every university in Australia has a building named after some major company. We're all expected to be working with industry in some form or another, and patents and IP are increasingly important within universities. I think generally, and I think you will likely agree with me, there is also a massive instrumentalization of education. Education is seen in terms of not how will this make me a better person, but what job can it get me after at the end? That's a different way of thinking about what the role of education is. And what then is the role of philosophy within that? It's certainly not seen as the kind of unifying discipline that it used to be. So what are we and where do we sit today? What is the role of philosophy? And that is what I want to think about. So first, what is philosophy? Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting about philosophy is that even among philosophers, there's no consensus about what it is we do. There's been, across the millennia, various definitions of philosophy, from thinking about it as a way of life through to things like the creation of concepts, which bear little question or direct relation to practice. But most of us will kind of agree in some sense with the Wikipedia definition of philosophy as a systematic study of fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, values, reason, mind, and language. This is actually the Google AI summary, but it's pretty much exactly what you will see on many philosophy department pages. I haven't done a full survey, but I think you could probably agree with me on that. So let's just go with that, for better or worse, and think more specifically, shifting away from a kind of definition of philosophy in its internal characteristics. Let's talk about the kind of external characteristics of philosophy as a discipline. And I want to point to three things about philosophy today. It's highly abstract. Abstraction is a key part of what philosophers do today. And actually, this is one of the reasons why I think philosophy is really almost inscrutable to even other people in humanities, because most of the humanities drive toward detail, very focused analyses of Jane Austen, for instance, or so on, whereas philosophy works in completely the other direction. So this is why people find thought experiments so wildly uncomfortable, right? Because they're a way of abstracting from reality, whereas most people in the humanities want to get closer to the text or whatever it is that they study. At the same time, philosophy is incredibly atomistic. It wants to break down problems into its smallest components in order to be able to solve them. And this is true, I think, of analytic philosophy in particular, or what we call analytic philosophy, that it's really about breaking down things into its smallest bits to see if they're tractable at that level. And as a consequence of those two things, philosophy is highly specialised. Even within the discipline of philosophy, there are many subdisciplines, and what we're finding today is that across those subdisciplines, we can barely speak to each other. So not only is philosophy not speaking to other people outside of the discipline, we can no longer necessarily speak to each other. That's a bit of a problem, right? Maybe. All right, so what do we now think about that in the context of the impact agenda? So what impact has the impact agenda had on the discipline of philosophy? And how can or should the discipline and individual philosophers respond to it? As I said, the impact agenda is not going away. So anyone at the start of their careers or mid-career is having to think about this question very, very hard, I think, because it will shape your career in very profound ways. Surprisingly to me, well, in some ways surprisingly, in other ways not so surprisingly, there's actually very little philosophical literature on the impact agenda and almost nothing on the impact of that agenda for philosophy. Disappointing. There is one empirical study that focused on how philosophers are responding to the impact agenda in the UK, and particularly in terms of the ref. And, you know, that's really nice in the way it kind of traces the different responses that people have and the kind of resistance mechanisms that people have developed and so on. And so there is a little bit of study. I can't dismiss it completely. And on the back of that, or related to that, we are currently, as I said before, undertaking some empirical research around the impact agenda in Australia. But the upshot is that there's very little actual discussion of the impact agenda in philosophy so far, though I know that there's a lot of thinking about it. So in response to that then, what I want to do for the rest of the paper is talk a little bit about what I see as one current response to the impact agenda that's emerging within the discipline of philosophy, and think a little bit about what that means for the discipline generally. And in the process of that, I will talk a little bit about my own research and use it as an example of what I'm going to call impact philosophy. So I think, looking across the discipline of philosophy, that in the last 20 or 15 years, 10 years in philosophy, in the discipline of philosophy, a different kind of practice of doing philosophy has emerged, which is geared toward having systematic impact in the world. It uses the tools of philosophy, but it's really geared toward engaging with stakeholders outside the university. So this way of doing philosophy is often collaborative. It's often multidisciplinary. It's always underpinned by evidence. It's never just theoretical. And I think that for the most part, yes, well, let's say it's always engaged with external stakeholders. That is its raison d'etre, if you like. So that's a broad shake, right? Let me say a little bit about what it's not, because these are the kinds of things that it might be similar to. So it's very much a kind of, it bears a family resemblance, if you like, to these things, but it's not exactly the same. So it's not applied philosophy or applied ethics. Applied philosophers and applied ethicists are typically the people doing this, but what they're doing is not straightforwardly applied ethics, because applied ethics or applied philosophy may itself have no impact. We all know examples of applied philosophy where someone has addressed a real-world problem in a paper that's written in, say, mind, or probably not mind, but ethics, and it's been read by 5 people. That's not impact philosophy. It's applied, but it's not impact. It's also not experimental philosophy, though it may bear some resemblance to it. Experimental philosophy has kind of drawn on survey data, or particularly quantitative data, to address problems, particularly around the cognitive sciences. What it bears most resemblance to is probably field philosophy, where you address a real world problem, you use empirical evidence to address that problem, and then you do some philosophizing about it. So it's a bit like that. But I think what's different about impact philosophy is that it ties empirical evidence very directly to normative goals. So if I can just give you a broad definition, it utilizes empirical evidence and philosophical tools to attain normative ends. So to give you an example of those ends, you might think about climate justice. So the ways in which people are kind of addressing questions around climate justice today is through engaging with stakeholders, doing empirical research, and melding that with philosophical analysis to make a difference in the world. So, of course, that means that the is-ought distinction, or the kind of move from the descriptive to the normative, is really central to what impact philosophers do. And again, something that we probably need to think further about. One note that I want to make is this supposed contrast that people might kind of think about that is often drawn between impact research and curiosity-driven research. And I want to say that I think that's a false dichotomy to begin with. But I think there's something instructive in that dichotomy that will tell us something important about impact philosophy, and that's how we design our projects. So curiosity-driven research often begins with a research question. You think, hey, that would be a really interesting thing to find out. So you kind of design your project around a research question. Impact philosophy starts at the other end. It starts with, what do I want to change in the world? And then it says, well, what do I need to know in order to be able to change that? So that might help you kind of think about how this is different, okay? The kind of ways in which we work are somewhat different. So I'll give you an example of impact philosophy by talking about my own research, because I do see myself as doing precisely this. So, as Aurelia mentioned before, I have a research group called the Reproduction in Society Group. This is something that I just fund through grants. So our aim is to undertake ethical, social and address ethical, social and regulatory issues arising from innovation in reproductive technologies and biomedical knowledge. We work with multiple stakeholders, including community members, large companies, stakeholders of various kinds, really, governments. So there's really three themes, or three broad themes to our work. One is perinatal genomics, where we think about things like prenatal testing. The most common genetic test in Australia is a prenatal test. And this is research that's been funded through the ARC, but we've also worked with large companies like Illumina, which is the largest genomics company in the world, and the Victorian Clinical Genetic Services. And what that is about is ensuring that genetics is integrated in a way that's equitable and fair. So you can see the normative end there. Again, with ART Innovation, this is a number of different small projects that we've undertaken, building up to a larger program. And it's really to ensure that the ways in which technologies are integrated into the reproductive space, or the assisted reproductive space in Australia, are equitable, ethical, and inclusive. Again, a normative end. But the one I want to focus on today is one project that I'm involved in around this technology called mitochondrial donation. This is something that I have been working on for close to 10 years through various projects, and which I am now involved in the world's second, possibly depending on your definition of clinical trial, the world's first clinical trial, real clinical trial of this technology. And I'll just talk a little bit about what I do within that program. So to give you a bit of a sense of the importance of this, It's really and I'll talk a little bit about the technology and why it matters. So it's a technology to help address a certain kind of mitochondrial disease. So many of you may know that mitochondria are found in every one of our cells. They are the things that help produce energy for our bodies. So they're really, really crucial to things like our brain, because our brain requires a lot of energy. They're relatively rare, but the true prevalence is unknown because they're really difficult to diagnose because they have a whole lot of different symptoms depending on the kind of mutation involved. Mitochondrial disease can be caused by mutations in the mitochondrial DNA or the nuclear DNA. So we have both of those types. Everyone knows you've got a mitochondrial genome and a nuclear genome. And the mitochondrial ones are the ones that this technology is useful for because they're only inherited from your mother. Your mitochondria is inherited from your mother, is inherited from her mother, is inherited from her mother, all the way down. It's not like nuclear DNA, it doesn't combine. So the important thing about these is that there's no cure for these diseases. They can be lethal. Kids often die before the age of 5, but there's no cure. Or sometimes, depending on the mutation, you will be fine until 30. There's one condition where men in particular will be fine until they're 30, and then within a couple of days, they'll go blind. So pretty serious conditions. So this technology, mitochondrial donation, was developed really over the course of a long time to address these conditions. The problem was that they are illegal. So they were explicitly prohibited in Australia through legislation called the Prohibition of Human Cloning for Reproduction Act, developed in 2002 in response to Dolly the sheep, which some of you may remember. And also something called the Research Involving Human Embryos Act. And Australia went through a process of legislative reform over a couple of years, which resulted in what's now called Mabe's Law, or the Mitochondrial Donation Law Reform Act of 2002. So that legislation amended the previous legislation to allow certain kinds of prohibited activities like creating an embryo with genetic material from 3 people to occur or be legal in Australia under an exception, like when you have a license for mitochondrial donation. It's an interesting legal structure in itself, I think, but I'm not going to get into that. In any case, it meant that in certain circumstances, you could do these otherwise illegal activities. You know, in other circumstances, if you did this, you would go to jail for 15 years. But when you have a license, you can do it. We're trying to get a license, obviously. So that was the legislative change in 2002. And then the government proposed this kind of 2-phase model of how to move forward with this technology. So the first stage, which we're currently in, was to undertake for around 5 years, kind of preclinical research and training, and then a clinical trial of 5 to 10 years, depending on, you know, how the results came through. And so that ultimately led to the funding of what we now call the Mito Hope program, that's run through Monash University, working with organisations like Monash IVF and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and a very, very large number of other partners around the country. And that is what I'm going to talk a little bit about, because that's the program that I'm very heavily involved in and takes up an enormous amount of time, including a meeting that I should be in right now. So that's what I'm talking about. So I've been involved in the kind of legislative change process right from the start, since about 2018, moving through to being able to put the technology into practice. So to give you a sense of what this program looks like, we have 3 different teams working. We have a clinical team, which is made up of mitochondrial disease specialists, obstetricians, gynecologists, that kind of group of medicos. We have a basic science stream, which is doing the preclinical work. And then we have our team, which we call the engagement and implementation stream, which I lead. And so you can see the various phases and various activities of this program, but more specifically, this is what we do in the engagement and implementation stream. So we are working across that whole program of 5 years of basic science and medical research, trying to kind of think about the ethical issues that are arising and the implications of our data for potential implementation in the wider healthcare system. So we're really contributing right across this to make sure that the program is responsive to the needs of the various communities that it's engaging, which include not only people with mitochondrial disease, but also people who might donate their oocytes or their eggs, through to the government departments that need to make a decision on whether to go ahead with this technology in the end. So we're doing quite a lot of work across that. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I just wanted you to get a picture of the kind of work that I mean by impact philosophy. So what about issues for further consideration then? There are, I think, some issues for people who do impact philosophy or who are considering doing something like impact philosophy. The first one, I think, is a question of personal integrity. You've got to think about what it is that you really want to do as an academic, what academic research means, what intellectual integrity means to you. I think there's often a sense, or some of the sense that people who do kind of applied ethics and applied philosophy get sometimes is that, as one of my colleagues said, a Japanese colleague said, we've sold our soul to the devil because we're not doing kind of abstract philosophy, and somehow that is a compromise. But from my perspective, I think about this question of personal integrity differently, because coming from a fairly marginal socioeconomic background, as a young academic, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that I was being paid a reasonably good salary from the government to just do stuff that interested me that no one was reading. That struck me as not aligning with my values. So I actually wanted to move into an area of philosophy that I could see some kind of benefit for someone other than me, that brought me in alignment with my own values much more significantly. So undertaking impact philosophy was actually a way of increasing my personal integrity rather than decreasing it. I think you also have to recognise the certain risks that are involved in doing impact philosophy. There are professional and kind of personal/public risks. The professional risk is that, yes, we have the impact agenda and everyone wants us to be doing impact, but no one recognises the toll of doing impact. It's time consuming, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of thinking and negotiating with stakeholders and so on, but none of that is recognised by the institution. What's recognised is how many publications we spit out at the end. It's not built into workload models in any way. It's great that we do it, everyone loves that we do it, but they don't want to actually see how it plays out or the implications of that for the institution and for the person doing it. Publicly, you may face certain kinds of backlash, public vilification, death threats. I have been called a monster, all because I want to help enhance the reproductive options for people with mitochondrial disease. People get death threats. I haven't actually got a death threat, but we'll see. We might get there. Something to aspire to. There's also, of course, a kind of question about depth and breadth. Because of the nature of what we do, we have to move fast and we have to deal with a lot of different stakeholders. So we're often thinking about philosophical issues in a broader kind of way that means that we don't necessarily get to the depth of an issue in the way that a more traditional philosopher might do. So that's just something that you have to become comfortable with, I think, as an impact philosopher. And it suits some people's intellectual kind of way of being, if you like, way of thinking. And of course, there's the question of disciplinary integrity. Is this actually philosophy? Is this really philosophy, or am I just saying that? So I think there's a feeling for many people that we have a kind of vexed relationship with philosophy. We use the tools of philosophy, but we use them in particular ways that are not just about doing philosophy. So one of the interesting things that I notice about philosophy as a discipline is that over the last decade, let's say, almost every philosophy department will describe itself as doing fundamental knowledge, like I said before. But when it comes to telling students what the value of that is, they will describe it in terms of translatable skills and critical thinking. But what's really interesting is that when philosophers themselves use those tools in ways other than just doing philosophy, it starts to look a little suspect. And I just wonder what's going on there, yeah? So anyway, I think that, or what I'm worrying about is that the impact agenda produces a certain kind of dilemma for philosophy. And I think this dilemma is something we need to think through in terms of our response as a discipline to the impact agenda. So the problem is that if we don't respond to the impact agenda and take up some of its imperatives, then philosophy will be seen as increasingly irrelevant. And we see evidence of that in the UK at the moment, where philosophy departments are being closed down every week. Okay, the number of people doing philosophy in universities in philosophy departments is decreasing dramatically. And that's because philosophy has not been able to respond, or has not yet responded proactively to the impact agenda. So we don't want that. The danger on the other side, though, if we do respond to the impact agenda and do what I've called impact philosophy, then philosophy becomes increasingly indistinct in terms of what it does. How is it different from sociology or the social sciences? How is it different from something else? What's unique about philosophy? That becomes harder to discern. So I think those are the two kind of dilemmas that we might, or two sides of the dilemma that we might need to think about in terms of determining a response for the discipline to the impact agenda. And I'll just talk briefly about two potential solutions. So one common response that we hear people actually say quite a lot, and which I'm tempted by. The pluralist in me kind of is tempted by this solution. And that's to say, well, actually not everyone needs to do impact. It's really great if we have an impact philosopher in the department, because that means that the department will look good in terms of the research funding and so on, and the rest of us can just go on and do our philosophy. We know that response. Everyone's heard that response. Not everyone has to do impact. And it's possibly true. The problem, I think, is that if we go with that line, we end up with a free rider problem within philosophy itself, where some people are doing the heavy lifting and in some ways being penalised for it because we're not writing the same kinds of papers in mind and ethics as our colleagues. But nevertheless, are the people keeping the discipline alive as an academic discipline. So, ponder that. The other response is a pragmatic one. We might say, well, okay, so this is the context that we're working in. So the pragmatic in me says, well, in that case, we should all just do a little bit of impact. Okay, we should change our research to do some kind of impact, and then we would have satisfied that. I think there are two problems here. One problem is that you get kind of what we might call fake impact. And to be honest, I've seen this a lot in grant applications. It's where there's a kind of patina of impact or application or real world problem, but what you're actually doing is just the same philosophy that you would have done without it. So, you know, fake impact. But more problematically, I think, with the pragmatic response is that we may end up in a vicious circle where philosophy, by virtue of responding proactively to the impact agenda, ends up becoming internally distinct. And then we still see the demise of philosophy departments because all of those people doing impact philosophy can just work in political science or bioethics or some other discipline without actually needing a philosophy department. So my final provocation then is to leave you with this question. What do we think is rare and valuable about philosophy in the time of impact? And when I say rare, I mean, what is it that philosophers themselves actually bring to the kind of contemporary debates that no one else can do or no one else can do as well? When I say valuable, I don't mean valuable in itself, which is where we often go when we're thinking about the value of philosophy, but what's valuable now, such that our departments won't be closed. That's the upshot of it. What's valuable now in the time of impact about what we do that will survive, that will help us maintain philosophy as part of the modern university to the extent that that institution itself survives. So that's my final provocation. Thanks.